An elderly couple bought a storage unit from a former president. What they found inside was shocking. The padlock gave way with a crack that echoed through the concrete corridor, and Martha Chen's arthritic fingers trembled as she pulled the rusted hasp free. Her husband Frank stood behind her, one hand braced against the corrugated metal door, the other clutching the auction receipt that had cost them their last $400. The door rolled upward with a shriek of metal on metal, and afternoon light spilled into the darkness, catching dust motes that rose like startled ghosts. Martha's breath stopped. There, stacked floor to ceiling in the 10 by 15 space, were bankers' boxes, dozens of them, maybe 100, each one stamped with an official-looking seal she couldn't quite make out in the shadows. But it was the wooden crate in the center, half covered by a military green tarp, that made her knees buckle. Frank caught her elbow. "Martha?" His voice was thin, reedy with age and concern. She couldn't answer. She was staring at the presidential seal carved into the crate's side, at the brass nameplate beneath it that read, "Property of William J. Harrison, 41st President of the United States, 1989-1993. Her mind went blank, except for one thought. They'd just bought a former president's secrets for the price of a used refrigerator. Wait before you see what's inside. If this story already has your heart pounding, tell us where you're watching from. When forgotten boxes open, when second chances hide under dust and debt, subscribe and stay close. You'll never guess what's been left behind. Now, back to the lock clicking open. Martha's hands found the edge of the crate and gripped it, her wedding ring catching the light. A thin gold band she'd worn for 53 years, through good times and lean ones, through the birth of 2 sons and the death of one, through factory closures and medical bills, and the slow erosion of the American dream they'd been promised in their youth. Now here they stood, 74 and 76 years old respectively, in a storage facility on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, gambling their grocery money on the contents of abandoned units because Frank's pension had been cut in half and Social Security didn't cover the cost of Martha's heart medication. "We should call someone," Frank said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was already stepping into the unit, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. "This has to be some kind of mistake. Presidents don't just lose their stuff in storage units." But Martha knew better. She'd spent 40 years as a secretary at a law firm before they downsized her department, and she'd seen how quickly important papers could be mislabeled, misfiled, forgotten in the chaos of office moves and estate transfers. Presidents were human, after all. They hired movers and assistants and archivists who made mistakes. They died, and their families fought over possessions, and things slipped through the cracks. William Harrison had died 8 years ago. She remembered seeing it on the news. The state funeral, the flags at half-mast, the retrospectives about his single term in office sandwiched between 2 more famous presidents. He'd been a decent man, people said, but unremarkable. A caretaker president who'd kept the seat warm and made no enemies, and left no lasting mark on history. Except now his mark was here, in Unit 247 of the Stowaway Storage Complex, and Martha and Frank Chen owned it. Frank was pulling the tarp away, his movements slow and careful despite the tremor in his hands. Parkinson's, early stage, the doctor had said, another bill they couldn't afford. Beneath the tarp, the crate was sealed with a simple latch, no lock. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs hard enough to hurt. She fumbled in her purse for the nitroglycerin tablets, slipped one under her tongue, felt the familiar burn and then the easing of pressure in her chest. "Martha, you okay?" Frank's eyes found hers in the dimness, and she saw in them the same mixture of fear and hope that had sustained them through 5 decades of marriage. They'd survived so much together. They could survive this. "Open it," she whispered. The latch clicked. The lid rose on silent hinges, and inside, Martha's breath caught. Photographs. Hundreds of them, loose and in albums, black and white in color, faces she didn't recognize and faces she did. There was President Harrison as a young man, lean and serious in military uniform. Harrison with his wife Margaret on their wedding day, her dress simple and elegant, his hand on her waist so gentle it made Martha's throat tight. Harrison with children, 3 of them, 2 boys and a girl, on a sailboat, squinting into summer sun. Harrison shaking hands with other presidents, senators, foreign dignitaries. Harrison alone in the Oval Office late at night, his face in his hands, the weight of the world on his shoulders. And beneath the photographs, wrapped in acid-free paper, were documents. Frank lifted one out carefully, unfolded it. His eyes widened. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, and Frank never took the Lord's name in vain. Martha leaned in to read over his shoulder. It was a letter, handwritten on White House stationery, dated March 15, 1991. The handwriting was elegant, measured, the script of someone who'd learned penmanship in a different era. "My dearest Margaret, am writing this at 3 a.m. because I cannot sleep and cannot share this burden with anyone else. Today, I ordered American forces to withdraw from Iraq. We could have gone to Baghdad. We could have removed Saddam Hussein from power. The generals wanted it. The hawks in my cabinet wanted it. But I remembered Vietnam. I remembered the quagmire, the mission creep, the years of blood and treasure poured into desert sand. So I said no. I ordered our troops home. And tonight I sit here knowing that this decision may cost me the next election, knowing that history may judge me a coward, knowing that Saddam Hussein will remain in power to torment his people and threaten his neighbors. But I also know that I've saved American lives. Thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands. Young men and women who will go home to their families, who will have children and grandchildren, who will live full lives because I chose restraint over glory. Is it enough? Will it be enough when they write the history books? I don't know, my love. I only know that I can live with being weak. I cannot live with unnecessary death on my hands. Forever yours, Bill." Martha's eyes were wet. Frank lowered the letter carefully, his hands shaking harder now. "There's more," he said, and his voice cracked. "There's so much more." They spent the next 2 hours in that storage unit, reading by flashlight as the afternoon faded into evening, reading until their eyes ached and their backs screamed and their hearts felt too full to contain everything they were learning. There were letters to Margaret spanning 40 years of marriage, letters full of doubt and love and the terrible loneliness of power. There were journals kept during Harrison's presidency, raw and unfiltered accounts of decisions made in the crucible of crisis. There were photographs that told the story of a life lived in service. Harrison visiting wounded soldiers in military hospitals. Harrison sitting with AIDS patients when AIDS was still a death sentence and politicians were afraid to be photographed touching the afflicted. Harrison in a soup kitchen ladling out food with his own hands, no cameras present, just a president doing what he believed was right. And there were the private things, the human things that Martha's heart break. A child's drawing, carefully preserved in plastic, with the caption, "My Daddy the President," in crayon. A menu from a restaurant in Paris where Harrison and Margaret had celebrated their 30th anniversary. A pressed flower, a white rose, with a note in Margaret's hand. "From the garden where you proposed, I love you still." "Why would anyone abandon this?" Martha whispered. "How could his family just let it go?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, his finger tracing the edge of a photograph. Harrison and Margaret in their later years, walking hand in hand through fallen leaves, looking at each other the way Martha and Frank still looked at each other after all this time. "Maybe they didn't know it was here," he said finally. Maybe after he died, Margaret couldn't face sorting through everything. Maybe she got sick too, and the kids were overwhelmed, and they hired a company to clear out the storage units, and something got missed. Or, he paused, maybe they fought over the estate. Maybe there was a lawsuit, and everything got frozen, and the storage bills didn't get paid, and this just fell through the cracks. Martha thought about their own sons. David, who called once a month from Seattle, where he worked in tech, always busy, always promising to visit soon. And Michael, whose ashes sat in an urn on their mantel because he'd gone to Afghanistan and come home in a flag-draped coffin 12 years ago. Michael, who'd believed in service and sacrifice and duty, who died at 23 years old for reasons Martha still didn't fully understand. "Frank," she said quietly, "what are we going to do?" He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the same question that was churning in her own mind. They could call the presidential library, they could call the Harrison family's lawyers, they could do the right thing, the legal thing, the thing that would see these precious documents and photographs return to their rightful place in history. But they could also sell them. The thought made Martha sick, but she couldn't push it away. $400. That's all they had in their checking account until next month Social Security came through. Frank's medications alone cost $320 every 30 days. Her heart pills were another $210. They'd already skipped meals to make ends meet. They'd already turned the thermostat down to 62 in winter and sweltered through summer without air conditioning. They'd already cut their phone plan to the cheapest option and canceled their cable and started buying the store-brand everything at the grocery store. And still, it wasn't enough. Still, they woke up every morning not knowing if this would be the month they'd have to choose between medicine and rent, between food and electricity. They were old and tired and scared, and Social Security, the system they'd paid into their entire working lives, gave them barely enough to survive. "We could get a lot of money for this," Frank said, and his voice was hollow. "Private collectors, auction houses. Hell, I bet we could sell just one of those letters for enough to cover our bills for a year." Martha closed her eyes. It would be stealing. "Is it?" Frank's voice rose, anger bleeding through. Anger she knew wasn't directed at her, but at the world, at the unfairness of growing old in a country that seemed to have forgotten them. "We bought this unit legally. We paid for it with money we needed for food. Whatever's inside is ours by law." "By law," Martha repeated, "but not by right." Frank's shoulders sagged. He looked at the box of letters in his hands, at the photograph of Harrison and Margaret walking through autumn leaves, and Martha saw tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. "I'm tired, Martha," he said. "I'm so goddamn tired of being poor. We worked our whole lives. We did everything right. We saved money, we raised good boys, we paid our taxes, we voted, we believed in the American dream. And what do we have to show for it? We're 2 steps away from losing our apartment. You had to delay your hip surgery because we can't afford the copay. I'm rationing my Parkinson's medication because the new one the doctor wants to try costs $800 a month. We're 70 years old, and we're eating ramen noodles like college students. And I'm tired." Martha moved to him, wrapped her thin arms around his thin frame, felt his body shaking with the weight of a dignity worn thin by poverty and age. She wanted to tell him it would be okay. She wanted to tell him they'd find a way. But the words stuck in her throat, because she was tired too. Bone-tired, soul-tired, tired in ways that sleep couldn't fix. They stayed like that for a long time, 2 old people holding each other in a storage unit full of ghosts and secrets and impossible choices. Finally, Martha pulled back. She cupped Frank's face in her hands, looked into the eyes she'd loved for more than half a century. "Let's take it home," she said. "Let's take it all home and figure out what to do. We don't have to decide tonight." Frank nodded. They loaded the boxes into the back of their ancient Honda Civic. 15 trips back and forth, because they could only carry one box at a time, because they were old and their bodies hurt, and they had to rest between each journey. The sun had set by the time they finished, and Columbus lights glittered in the distance, a city that seemed to belong to younger, luckier people. They drove home in silence. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had been nice once, 40 years ago, before the neighborhood had declined and the landlord had stopped making repairs. The elevator was broken again, so they carried the boxes up one by one, resting on each landing, Martha's heart hammering, Frank's hands shaking. By the time they got the last box inside, it was past midnight, and they were both exhausted. Martha made tea with the cheap store-brand bags that tasted like cardboard, and they sat at their small kitchen table surrounded by boxes that held a president's life, staring at each other in the fluorescent light that hummed and flickered. "I met him once," Martha said suddenly. "President Harrison." Frank's eyebrows rose. "You never told me that." "It was at a law conference in 1992, right before the election. He gave a speech about judicial reform, boring stuff mostly, but afterward there was a reception, and I ended up standing next to him at the coffee table. His security detail was off to the side, trying to be subtle but failing, and he turned to me and said, 'Do you think they'd notice if I snuck out the back and got a real cup of coffee? This stuff tastes like motor oil.'" Martha smiled at the memory. I laughed, and he laughed too, and we talked for maybe 5 minutes about nothing important, coffee and the weather, and how much nicer Ohio was than Washington in the fall. He asked me my name and what I did, and when I said I was a legal secretary, he said, "Secretaries run the world. Presidents just read the speeches." And then someone came to pull him away to meet some congressman or judge or whatever. But I remember thinking, he's just a person, just a regular person who happens to have the hardest job in the world. Frank reached across the table and took her hand. "What do you want to do, Martha?" She was quiet for a long time, looking at the boxes, thinking about the letters she'd read, about Harrison writing to his wife at 3 in the morning, agonizing over decisions that would save lives or cost them, bearing the weight of history on shoulders that were only human after all. She thought about Michael, her boy, her beautiful, brave boy who'd believed in something bigger than himself and paid the ultimate price. She thought about David in Seattle, too busy with his successful life to visit, and she didn't blame him, she didn't, but God, she missed having family close. She thought about Frank's trembling hands and her own failing heart and the long, slow decline that was old age in America when you didn't have money. "I want to read them all," she said finally. "Every letter, every journal entry, every document. I want to understand who William Harrison was before I decide what to do with his life." Frank squeezed her hand. "That could take weeks." "Then it takes weeks." Martha stood, her hips screaming in protest, and opened the nearest box. "We've got time. What else are we going to do? Watch TV we can't afford cable for? Go out to restaurants we can't afford to eat at?" So they read. They read for 16 hours the next day, stopping only to eat crackers with peanut butter and drink more terrible tea. They read about Harrison's childhood in rural Pennsylvania, son of a coal miner who died of black lung when Bill was 12. They read about how he joined the Navy at 17, served in Vietnam, come home decorated and traumatized. They read about law school on the GI Bill, about meeting Margaret at a church social, about falling in love and building a life and running for Congress because he believed, actually believed, that government could be a force for good. They read about his steady rise through politics, about the compromises he'd made and the principles he'd held on to, about the phone call telling him he'd been chosen as vice president, and the phone call 8 years later telling him the president had died of a heart attack and he was now the leader of the free world. And they read about the terrible, crushing loneliness of the presidency. "Margaret," one letter said, "today I sent young men and women to war. I looked at their files, their photographs, their service records, their letters to their families. I memorized their names: Jenkins, Rodriguez, O'Connor, Washington, Kim. 23 years old, 20, 19, 18. The same age our Billy was when he got married. I sent them into harm's way, and I will never forget their faces. If they die, I will carry their names to my grave." This is what it means to be president. This is the weight we do not talk about in campaign speeches. Martha wept reading that letter, thinking about Michael, about all the young men and women who'd served and died and been carried home to parents who would never be whole again. They read about Harrison's decision not to run for a second term, a decision he'd wrestled with for months but had ultimately made because Margaret was sick, because the cancer that would eventually take her was already stealing her strength. And he wanted whatever time they had left to belong to them, not to history. "I am choosing love over legacy," he'd written in his journal. "History will not think kindly of a one-term president who declined to run again. But Margaret is dying, and I will not spend her last years traveling the country making speeches and kissing babies. I will spend them with her, holding her hand, telling her I love her, making sure she knows that of all the things I've done in this life, loving her was the best and most important. Let history judge me as it will. I know what matters." "Jesus," Frank whispered, his voice thick. "He gave up the presidency for her." Martha nodded, unable to speak. She was thinking about Frank's diagnosis, about the Parkinson's that would slowly rob him of his movement and his independence, about the years ahead of them, however many there were, and what she would sacrifice to make them good years, gentle years, loving years. They read for another 2 days, barely eating, barely sleeping, possessed by the need to understand the man whose secrets they now held. They read about his final years after Margaret's death, about his retreat from public life, about the small joys he'd found in gardening and reading and writing letters to old friends. They read about his death at 84, peaceful and at home, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. And then, in the last box they opened, Martha found the manuscript. It was thick, easily 500 pages, bound in a simple black folder, typed on an old-fashioned typewriter that had left impressions deep enough to feel on the back of each page. The title page read, "What They Don't Tell You About Being President, a Memoir," by William J. Harrison, unpublished. Martha's hands trembled as she turned to the first page. "If you're reading this, I'm dead," the manuscript began. "That's the only condition under which I want this published, when I'm safely beyond caring what people think. I've spent my entire life in public service, and I've spent my entire life biting my tongue, choosing my words carefully, never saying what I really thought, because presidents don't get to be honest. Presidents have to be symbols, icons, marble statues, with no flaws and no doubts and no humanity. But I was human. God knows I was human. I made mistakes. I had regrets. I stayed awake at night wondering if I'd made the right choices, if the people I'd sent to die had died for good reasons, if the policies I'd supported would help or harm the people I'd sworn to serve. This is the book they don't let presidents write while they're alive. This is the truth behind the speeches, the real story behind the official history. I wrote it for my children and grandchildren so they would know who I really was, not who the history books say I was. If it ever sees the light of day, I hope it helps someone. I hope it makes the presidency seem less like a prize to be won and more like a burden to be carried. I hope it makes people understand that presidents are just human beings doing their best in impossible circumstances. And if nothing else, I hope it proves that doubt and humility aren't weaknesses in a leader. They're necessities. Martha looked up at Frank, her eyes wide. Frank, this could change how people think about him, about that whole era of history. Frank was reading over her shoulder, his breath catching. The Harrison Library would pay anything for this. The family would want it. Scholars would. Or we could sell it to a publisher, Martha said quietly, for a lot of money. Enough money to live on for the rest of our lives. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and poisonous. Martha thought about the Harrison she'd come to know through his letters and journals. A good man, a decent man, a man who'd chosen love over glory and truth over legend. A man who'd written this manuscript so his grandchildren would understand him, who'd wanted it published only after his death so he could be honest without political consequences. And she thought about herself and Frank, about their empty bank account and their mounting bills and the long, frightening slide toward poverty and desperation, about Frank's shaking hands and her failing heart, and the fact that they'd worked their whole lives and it still wasn't enough. "What would Michael do?" she asked quietly. Frank was silent. Then, "Michael would say we should give it back. He'd say it was the right thing." He'd talk about honor and duty and doing what's right even when it's hard. And David? David would tell us to sell it. He'd say we earned it, that we're owed this, that we shouldn't have to be poor in our old age. Frank's voice was bitter. David would say the system failed us and we don't owe it anything. Which one of them is right? Frank looked at her, and in his eyes Martha saw the whole long history of their marriage, the struggles and the triumphs, the disappointments and the joys, the slow accumulation of years that had brought them to this moment, to this impossible choice. "I don't know," he said. "I honestly don't know anymore." Martha stood and walked to the window. Their apartment overlooked a parking lot, and, beyond it, the highway that cut through Columbus like a scar. Headlights streamed past in the darkness, people going somewhere, people with places to be and purposes to fulfill. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and thought about choices and consequences, about right and wrong and the vast gray area in between. "When I was young," she said, "things seemed simpler. You worked hard, you were honest, you did the right thing, and life worked out. That was the deal. That was the promise." "And now?" Frank asked. "Now, I'm not sure there ever was a deal. Or if there was, someone broke it a long time ago." She turned to face him. "But I'm still the person I was raised to be. I'm still the person who believes in doing right even when it costs you, even when it hurts." Frank's eyes filled. "Martha." "We're going to give it back," she said firmly. "All of it. The letters, the journals, the photographs, the manuscript. We're going to find out who's supposed to have it, and we're going to give it back. And we're not going to ask for anything in return." "We'll be broke," Frank said. "We'll be completely broke. We spent our last $400 buying that unit." "I know." Martha moved to him, took his shaking hands in hers. "But we'll still have each other. And we'll still be able to look ourselves in the mirror. And we'll still be the kind of people who do the right thing even when it's hard. That's worth more than money." Frank pulled her into his arms, and they stood there in their shabby kitchen surrounded by a dead president's secrets. Two old people who decided that integrity mattered more than survival, even if it killed them. "I love you," Frank whispered into her hair. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Martha said. "Always." The next morning, Martha called the William J. Harrison Presidential Library in Philadelphia. She was transferred 3 times before reaching someone who seemed to have authority, a woman named Dr. Eleanor Vance, the library's chief archivist. "I understand you have some items that may have belonged to President Harrison," Dr. Vance said, her voice professional and slightly skeptical. "Can you describe them?" Martha described the letters, the journals, the photographs, the manuscript. With each detail, Dr. Vance's voice grew more strained, more urgent. "Mrs. Chen," she said finally, "what you're describing, those items were thought to be lost. President Harrison's children donated most of his papers to the library after his death, but there were gaps in the collection, significant gaps. Letters that Margaret Harrison had mentioned in her own journals, but that we could never locate. The manuscript that President Harrison told his son about, but that disappeared after Margaret's death. We assumed they'd been destroyed or lost in the estate settlement." "They were in a storage unit," Martha said. "We bought it at auction." There was a long pause. "Mrs. Chen, those items are of immense historical value. The manuscript alone, if it's genuine, would be one of the most significant presidential memoirs ever written. It would change our understanding of Harrison's presidency, of that entire era. We would very much like to examine them, and if you're willing to sell them, we're prepared to make you a very generous offer." Martha's heart hammered. Here it was, the moment when she could ask for enough money to save herself and Frank, to live comfortably for the rest of their days, to stop being afraid every time they opened the mailbox and saw another bill they couldn't pay. "I don't want to sell them," she said. "I want to give them to you. They belong in the library. They belong to history." Another pause, longer this time. "Mrs. Chen, I don't think you understand. These items could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more. You have every legal right to—" "I don't care about the money," Martha interrupted. And even as she said it, even as her practical mind screamed at her for lying, she knew it was true. President Harrison wrote that manuscript for his family. He wrote those letters to his wife. They're personal, they're precious, and they deserve to be preserved and shared with people who will care for them properly. We're just the people who found them. We don't have any right to profit from them." "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Vance's voice had changed, softened with something like awe. "In my 20 years as an archivist, I've never encountered someone who, most people would sell them. They'd be within their rights to sell them." "I'm sure they would," Martha said, "but I'm not most people. When can you come get them?" Dr. Eleanor Vance arrived the next afternoon with 2 assistants and an appraiser from Sotheby's, a thin, nervous man who handled each document with gloved hands and made small, distressed noises as he examined them. Martha and Frank watched as the team carefully photographed and cataloged each item, treating the boxes of letters and photographs like sacred relics. "It's all here," Dr. Vance kept saying, her voice trembling with excitement. "It's all here, and it's all real. These are Harrison's handwritten letters. This is his unpublished manuscript. These photographs, my God, we didn't even know these existed." The appraiser looked up from the manuscript, his face pale. "Dr. Vance, the cultural and historical value of this collection is incalculable. The manuscript alone would sell at auction for at least $2 million, possibly much more. The letters, the journals, the photographs. We're looking at a collection worth somewhere between $5 and $10 million. Martha felt the room tilt. She sat down heavily, her hand pressed to her chest. $10 million! They could have had $10 million. They could have lived like royalty for the rest of their lives, could have left money to David, could have set up a scholarship in Michael's name, could have fixed every broken thing in their lives, and still had more than they could ever spend. And she'd just given it away. Frank's hand found her shoulder, gripped it tight. She looked up at him and saw in his eyes the same shock, the same regret, the same terrible certainty that they'd made the right choice, even as it destroyed them. "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Vance said gently, kneeling beside Martha's chair, "please, let me give you something for this. Even if you won't accept fair market value, let me offer you a finder's fee. $50,000, $100,000, please." Martha shook her head. "President Harrison chose love over legacy," she said quietly. "He gave up the most powerful position in the world so he could be with his wife when she was dying. The least I can do is give up money so his words can reach the people they were meant for." "You're remarkable," Dr. Vance said, and there were tears in her eyes. "You're both remarkable." "We're just old people trying to do right," Frank said. "That's all we've ever been." The team finished cataloging the collection as the sun set outside the apartment's single window. They loaded everything carefully into climate-controlled cases, and Dr. Vance had each of them sign documentation acknowledging the transfer of the materials to the Presidential Library. Before they left, Dr. Vance pressed a business card into Martha's hand. "If you ever need anything," she said, "anything at all, please call me." Martha nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She watched from the window as the team carried the last box down to their van, watched them drive away with a dead president's life packed carefully in the back, watched $10 million disappear into the Columbus night. Then she turned to Frank, and they held each other, and they cried. 3 weeks later, Martha was sorting through the mail, bills mostly, and a notice that their rent was going up $50 a month starting in January, when she found a thick envelope from the William J. Harrison Presidential Library. Inside was a letter from Dr. Vance. "Dear Martha and Frank, I wanted you to be the first to know that we've authenticated the entire collection you donated, and we'll be unveiling it to the public next month with a special exhibition titled The Private Harrison: Letters, Journals, and the Unpublished Memoir of America's 41st President. The manuscript you found is extraordinary. President Harrison was brutally honest about his doubts, his mistakes, and his regrets. He wrote about the pressure of the presidency, about the impossible choices he faced, about the cost of leadership on his mental health and his family. It's one of the most human and vulnerable accounts of the presidency ever written, and it's going to change how historians and the public understand both Harrison and the office itself. But that's not why I'm writing. After news of your donation became public, we were contacted by the Harrison family. President Harrison's daughter, Caroline, wanted me to tell you that reading her father's letters to her mother has been one of the greatest gifts of her life. Her parents' marriage was the foundation of their family, but she'd never fully understood the depth of their love and partnership until she read those letters. She's grateful beyond words that you chose to donate them rather than sell them. The family has asked if they might meet you if you're willing, and they've also done something else. Enclosed, please find a check. The family wanted to offer you a reward for your integrity and your generosity. I know you said you didn't want money, but please consider accepting this. You've given us back a piece of history that we thought was lost forever. Let us give you something in return." Martha's hands shook as she pulled out the second envelope. Inside was a check made out to Frank and Martha Chen in the amount of $500,000. She stared at it, unable to process what she was seeing. $500,000. Not the millions the collection was worth, but more money than she and Frank had ever dreamed of having. Enough to pay off every bill, to afford all their medications, to live comfortably for the rest of their lives, to stop being afraid. "Frank," she called, her voice breaking, "Frank, come here." He came shuffling in from the bedroom, and when she showed him the check, he sank into a chair, his face gray. "They didn't have to do this," he whispered. "We told them we didn't want money." I know, Martha's vision was blurred with tears, but they wanted to give it anyway. She thought about President Harrison writing to his wife at 3 in the morning, about his decision to choose love over legacy, about the weight of doing what was right even when it cost everything. And she thought about herself and Frank, about their choice to give back what they could have kept, about integrity and sacrifice, and the strange, mysterious way that grace sometimes found you when you least expected it. "What do we do?" Frank asked. Martha looked at the check, then at her husband, then at the photograph on their mantel, Michael in his army uniform, 23 years old, smiling at a future he would never have. "We accept it," she said, "with gratitude, and then we do something with it that would make Michael proud." 6 months later, on a warm spring afternoon, Martha and Frank stood in front of a small storefront in a neighborhood not far from their apartment. The sign above the door read, "The Michael Chen Veterans Support Center, providing mental health services, job placement, and emergency financial assistance to veterans in need." "You ready?" Frank asked, his hand steady in Martha's, steadier than it had been in years, thanks to the new medication they could finally afford. "I'm ready," Martha said. They cut the ribbon together, and the small crowd gathered outside applauded. There were veterans in the crowd, young and old, men and women who'd served and come home broken and forgotten. There were social workers and therapists who'd volunteered to staff the center. There were city council members and local reporters, and Dr. Eleanor Vance, who'd driven down from Philadelphia for the opening. And there were Caroline Harrison and her brothers, William Jr. and Thomas, who'd used part of their own inheritance to help fund the center because they believed in honoring their father's legacy of service. Martha gave a short speech about Michael, about the son who'd believed in something bigger than himself, about the thousands of veterans who came home from war only to find themselves adrift in a country that had promised to support them but too often failed to keep that promise. She talked about second chances and the responsibility that came with good fortune, about using money not just to secure your own comfort but to lift up others who were struggling. "My husband and I could have kept that money for ourselves," she said, her voice steady and clear. "We could have lived comfortably and never thought twice about the young men and women who were living on the streets, battling addiction, dealing with trauma and PTSD, and the invisible wounds of war. But we couldn't do that. We couldn't honor the memory of our son by hoarding wealth when there were veterans who needed help." She looked at Frank, and he nodded, and she continued. "President Harrison wrote in his memoir that the measure of a leader isn't the glory they achieve, but the people they serve. We're not leaders. We're just two old people who stumbled into something extraordinary and tried to do the right thing with it. But we believe that what he wrote applies to all of us. The measure of a life isn't what you keep for yourself. It's what you give away to help others." The applause when she finished was thunderous. Afterward, as the crowd filtered into the center for the reception, Caroline Harrison approached Martha and took her hands. She was in her 60s, elegant and composed, but her eyes were red-rimmed. "Thank you," she said simply. "My father would have loved this. He would have loved you." "I wish I'd known him better," Martha said. "That one conversation at the coffee table was so brief." Caroline smiled. "He wrote about that, you know, in his journals. November 1992. He wrote about meeting a legal secretary from Ohio who made him laugh, who treated him like a normal person instead of a president. He wrote that it was one of the few genuinely human moments in a campaign that felt increasingly mechanical and false. You made an impression on him." Martha's throat tightened. "I had no idea." "That was Dad," Caroline said softly. "He noticed people. He remembered them. He carried their stories with him." She paused, her voice dropping. "I read all of his letters to my mother, every single one. And I want you to know, the love in those letters, the way he cherished her and valued their life together above everything else, that wasn't just words. That was real." My mother died knowing she was the most important thing in his world, and that's a gift not everyone gets. Thank you for making sure I got to see that, got to understand that." Martha embraced her, this stranger who felt like family, this daughter of a president who'd been just a man trying to love well and lead honorably in impossible circumstances. That evening, Martha and Frank sat on the roof of their apartment building. They'd paid to have it renovated into a community space with chairs and plants and string lights that glowed softly in the gathering dusk. Frank's Parkinson's was under control now, his tremor reduced to the faintest shake, and Martha's new medication had stabilized her heart. They still lived in the same apartment. They'd chosen not to move, chosen to stay in the neighborhood they knew, among the people they'd lived alongside for decades. But they'd paid off all their debts, set up trust funds for David and his children, and devoted the rest of the money to the center that bore their son's name. "Do you ever regret it?" Frank asked, "giving the collection back instead of selling it?" Martha thought about the question, really thought about it. She thought about the $10 million they could have had, about the life of luxury and ease that money could have bought. And then she thought about the letters she'd read, about President Harrison choosing love over legacy, about the veterans who would get help at Michael's center, about the way Caroline Harrison's face had looked when she talked about reading her parents' love letters. "No," she said, "I don't regret it, not even a little bit." Frank nodded, unsurprised. "Me neither." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars came out one by one above Columbus. Two old people who'd been given an impossible gift and had chosen to share it rather than hoard it, who'd stumbled into history and emerged with their integrity intact and their hearts full. Below them, the city hummed with life. People struggling and striving, failing and succeeding, trying to build good lives in a complicated world. And in one small storefront in a neglected neighborhood, a light burned bright where veterans could find help, where Michael Chen's legacy lived on, where the ripple effects of one couple's choice to do right would spread outward in ways they'd never fully know. Martha thought about President Harrison's words. "The measure of a life isn't what you keep for yourself, it's what you give away to help others." She reached for Frank's hand, felt his fingers intertwine with hers, felt the solid reality of 53 years of love and partnership and choosing each other through every hardship. "We did good," Frank said quietly. "We did," Martha agreed. And in the gentle spring night, with stars above and the city below, and a future that suddenly seemed less frightening than it had in years, they sat together in the peace that comes from knowing you've lived your life with honor, that you've chosen right over easy, that you've loved well and sacrificed willingly and left the world a little better than you found it. The storage unit was empty now, its secrets released to history. But Martha and Frank Chen were full of love, full of purpose, full of the quiet joy that comes from knowing that even at the end of the road, even in your 70s with failing bodies and limited time, you can still make choices that matter, can still change lives, can still be the kind of people who do the right thing even when it costs you everything. And in the end, that was worth more than $10 million. That was worth everything.